A weirdly common problem in Final Fantasy XIV, possibly especially because of the age of the game combined with the amount of changes the game has got over the years, is that some players will claim that something is true without ever checking if it actually is. Either because they assumed it is the way they think, or because it was like that at some point. Welcome to Final Fantasy XIV Mythbusters, where I and my friends highlight the odd claims and misconceptions players make, and test them to see whether they are true or not, while also explaining how you can test it yourself so you can learn how to science stuff in Final Fantasy XIV. Number 1. Damage over time and healing over time effects cannot critical hit or direct hit. False. So just to start, obviously healing cannot direct hit, and that includes healing over time effects, or HOTS for short, which of course also means that I'm implying that damage over time effects, or DOTS for short, can direct hit. What gives rise to this particular myth is the simple fact that the numbers that appear from DOTS and HOTS are always the same size. Where direct damage or healing effects that direct hit have slightly bigger text, crits have an exclamation mark, and the combined critical direct hits have 2 exclamation marks, making them easily distinguishable from normal hits. The myth is of course also further perpetuated by the fact that these over time effects don't really stand out much, with the numbers being relatively small in text and happening more in the background. Meaning that to actually see that they can crit, you would have to see how much damage the dot does normally, and then observe that sometimes it is significantly more than that. That is to say, this myth can be proven false simply by grabbing any job with a dot or a hot, with equipment on that gives you a decent crit chance and a decent direct hit chance, and simply maintain your dot or hot on the target and take note of the damage or healing numbers. I can guarantee you that the random variance in damage is not 25%. Far less in fact. So anything dealing that much more damage than the average is going to be a direct hit, and anything beyond that is likely a crit. And once they start nearing double damage, it is probably a critical direct hit. Number 2. Afflatus Misery is always damage neutral. False, but not in the way that you think. This is a myth that has cropped up as a result of the observation that with Endwalker, Afflatus Misery eventually got buffed to a point where it does precisely the same damage as 4 glares. This means that casting Afflatus Solace or Rapture 3 times in succession and then casting Afflatus Misery is equal in power to casting Glare 4 times. In a vacuum, this is absolutely true. However, Final Fantasy XIV combat is not a vacuum. I know, shocking. I can point out 4 somewhat different contexts in which Afflatus Misery is not actually damage neutral. Let's go with them. 1. You actually need to spend 3 lilies and then cast Misery for it to actually become neutral. As long as you have not cast Misery yet, you have not gotten a refund on your investment yet. So if the fight ends before you can accumulate and spend 3 lilies and use Misery, then technically this is actually a DPS loss. That's arguably not super significant if you needed those lilies for healing, but if you were dumping them to use Misery specifically, then this is slightly more significant. 2. Area of Effect, or AoE for short. Afflatus Misery does 620 potency on secondary targets, which is 20 potency more than 4 holy casts. On top of that, the primary target of course still takes the full 1240 potency, which is of course 640 more than 4 holy casts. From that, it is a DPS gain to cast 3 lilies and Misery in a situation where you could have cast holy. By that same token, if a single target boss fight has an ad phase, casting lilies in a time where there is only 1 target, meaning you're spending lilies instead of casting glare, but you use Misery once there are more targets on the field, then this is also a DPS gain, and so not neutral. 3. If you're spending your lilies in a time period where there is nothing to attack, then it is not considered an investment in the same way as example 1, as you are not actually sacrificing damage to spend those lilies. This particular context is a lot more common in dungeons, running between packs, but can sometimes be relevant in boss fights when the boss is untargetable anyway. 4. Damage buffs. If you are spending lilies while you have no damage bonuses whatsoever, then you are sacrificing 310 potency glare casts to use lilies. But if you then use Misery at a time where you are affected by a damage buff, for example, let's say Technical Finish, which is a 5% damage bonus, then Afflatus Misery would be equivalent to 4 glass with a 5% damage bonus, which is more than what you originally invested. That means it cost you 1240 potency to prepare and cast Misery, but Misery itself dealt 1302 potency of damage, leading it to be a damage gain. In a more coordinated group, it is more likely you would have more damage buffs than that, meaning that this particular context can be a lot more impactful. Number 3. What happens if 2 paladins cover the same target? This was posed as a question after some of the prior episodes of this series had cover extensively. So the question is, will both covers work? Will it split the damage? Will the closest paladin take the damage? Or what? So to test this, you need at least 2 paladins and 1 more friend. Both paladins must have access to cover. Have the additional friend pull some mobs. Once you're sure the mobs will keep up the attack, have both paladins cover the non-paladin. What happens is that applying cover to a player that is already affected by cover turns out to remove the first cover and override it with the second one. This is not too surprising of a result, but a little bit maybe, since both covers wouldn't have been entirely worthless, since if one paladin steps too far away, having both covers up on one target would mean that you at least still have one protecting. Nevertheless, this of course leads to further questions. Number 4. What happens if one paladin covers one target and then another paladin covers the first paladin? What would indeed happen if we had a daisy chain of paladins covering each other? Will the damage pass down the entire chain and have the last person in it take the damage? If so, what if we had a loop of paladins? What then? Anyway, to test this, we simply need, again, 2 paladins and 1 more friend. Let's call them Friend A, Paladin A, and Paladin B. Have Friend A pull some mobs, and for extra accuracy, make sure that Paladin A also has at least 1 mob attacking them. It'll make sense shortly. When you're confident they will keep up the attack, have Paladin A use cover on Friend A, and then have Paladin B use cover on Paladin A. The not too surprising result of this test is that the cover on Friend A redirects the damage to Paladin A, meaning the damage from mobs attacking Friend A will land ultimately on Paladin A. However, the damage from mobs directly attacking Paladin A will then be redirected to Paladin B, meaning that the damage Friend A was intended to take never touches Paladin B despite the chain. This sort of already answers the next question on its own, but I do think it is still nice for completeness' sake to take it anyway. Number 5. What happens if 2 paladins cover each other? This is essentially the loop of covers question reduced to its minimum parts. The question is whether it is possible for 2 paladins to cover each other simultaneously, and if so, where will the damage go? To test this, you simply need 2 paladins, Paladin A and B, to each pull something and be actively taking damage. Then have both paladins cover each other. The result is that Paladin A takes the damage from attacks targeting Paladin B, and Paladin B takes the damage from attacks targeting Paladin A. Not very surprising given the information we already learned in the 2 prior tests. However, these kinds of science-y tests can be interesting if we have 2 paladins in a single group for some reason. Unfortunately, there's very little value in using more than 1 cover at a time, unless those 2 covers result in 2 completely different chains. Maybe you want to protect both of the healers, in which case it does make sense. Number 6. Holmgang grants immunity to knockback effects. False. I'm going to start by highlighting that this claim actually was true for quite a while. In fact, the original reason why Holmgang made you immune to knockbacks was because Holmgang actually rooted you to the floor so you couldn't actually move at all. This particular part of the ability was removed with Shadowbringers, but it turned out that you still resisted knockbacks for a long time past that change, even if the tooltip didn't even mention it. However, at some point, I'm not exactly sure when, but I believe sometime mid-Endwalker, this was quietly fixed, meaning that Holmgang no longer prevents knockbacks. This is obviously very finicky to actually test, because there are many strange knockbacks in Final Fantasy XIV that outright ignore knockback immunities, ironically, meaning that every time it has failed, there's a reasonable chance the warrior would simply go, oh, I guess knockback immunity doesn't work on this mechanic, rather than observing that Holmgang no longer has this hidden feature. There's also the fact that Inner Release giving about 25% uptime of knockback immunity as a free bonus makes it reasonably possible that Inner Release covers most of the knockback immunity needs beyond arm's length, and the rest can be dealt with knockback cancelling using your dashes. However, the ultimate demonstration of Holmgang no longer having a built-in knockback immunity is as simple as demonstrate that a knockback or pushing effect is blockable with arm's length, and then demonstrate that it is not blockable with Holmgang. For this demonstration, I've chosen Sophia Extreme as my battlefield of choice. The landing of the scales in this fight shoves you very far across the arena, however it is completely blockable with arm's length, as you observe here. I immediately remove arm's length and replace it with Holmgang before the second scales come down, and you can see here that I slide across the arena despite Holmgang. Now, some of you may then say, oh, but the knockback immunity probably only works if you use Holmgang with a target, since that's how it used to work. Since back when it actually gave you knockback immunity by rooting you, it was because it rooted you and your target. However, I will also demonstrate that this doesn't work. For our second demonstration, we go to Alamigo and fight our good friend Xenos. Art of the Swell knocks you back. For the first Art of the Swell, I use Holmgang targeting Xenos himself and get pushed away. For the second Art of the Swell, I instead use arm's length and are not pushed back. Once again, I do want to underline that Holmgang did actually give knockback immunity at some point, but when exactly this hidden feature, as it became, disappeared, I'm not sure. Number 7. Vengeance not only prevents arm's length's slow from applying, but actually completely nullifies arm's length in its entirety, making its knockback immunity not work either. False. A claim raised in extension of the demonstration in episode 6 of Final Fantasy XIV Mythbusters. In that episode, we demonstrated that Vengeance actually prevents arm's length from applying its slow. It was then claimed in extension that this is actually because Vengeance completely stops arm's length from working in its entirety. This is, of course, easy to demonstrate is false. We return to Sophia. We already know that arm's length can prevent the knockback, or sliding effect of the scales, so we use Vengeance and then arm's length, and the knockback immunity works as intended. However, I was so caught up in that demonstration that I promptly slid off the platform afterwards. This, however, does not have much to do with the test itself. So, if you know about some strange myth in Final Fantasy XIV, or regularly run into some absurd claim that you are confident just isn't right, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, originally in A Realm Reborn patch 2.0, Holmgang's entire effect was that it rooted the warrior and their target in place for 6 seconds. But the range was an astounding 3 yalms. In patch 2.1, this was extended to 6 yalms and the cannot die effect was added. 2.1 also enabled the warrior to turn while affected by Holmgang, which is quite weird when you think about it. This probably explains why warrior learns their invulnerability much sooner than the other tanks. It wasn't actually an invulnerability originally.